Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started now. My name is Amy Groughton, and I am the Marketing Manager here at GreenSoft Technology. I'm just going to go over some quick introductions and information on our webinar before I hand it over to Randy to start the presentation. So today's webinar is called Complying with EU REACH in 2018. It will be presented by Randy Flinders, who is GreenSoft's Senior Manager of Product Support. Randy has been with GreenSoft for 4 years now. He's one of our experts in compliance, and he has been working in product certification and compliance for over 20 years. So thank you for presenting this webinar for us today, Randy. For our attendees, your computer audio is automatically set to mute, so we won't be able to hear you if you speak. If you have any questions or if you need Randy to repeat anything, you can type your questions or comments into the Q&A or chat box on your Zoom control panel, and we'll be able to see it there. So Randy will call for questions at the end of the webinar, and he will answer the questions then at the end. But if you have any questions anytime or at the end, you can again type them into that Q&A box that you see in your control panel. A document with all the questions and Randy's answers to them will be sent to each of you in a few days after the webinar, so you can reference it there. And this webinar is being recorded, so a link to the recording will also be included in that email, so you can reference that going forward. And we'll also include a PDF copy of the webinar slides in that email as well. So with that, let's turn it over to Randy and get started.
I have a lot of info that I want to cover, and I don't want to waste anybody's time here. So just a little bit of the agenda of what we're going to get into. So initially, I'm just going to go over GreenSoft, who we are, what we do, not to make a sales pitch to you, but just so that you understand where this information is coming from, why we feel like we have some information that's of value to share. Then I'm going to go right into talking about areas of concern for people who produce articles, which are products. So basically, everybody here probably produces some type of product. And what I want to do is cover initially, what are the kind of things we need to be thinking of as we're putting our compliance process together? In other words, where are the gotchas? Where are the main concerns? Once we get that done, then I'm going to go into detail and do the SV8C candidate list. We're going to find out what a substance of very high concern is, what we're supposed to do with that list, and what our responsibilities are, and some best practices and how we can comply with those requirements. Then we're going to do the same thing with Annex 14 and Annex 17, which are the authorization list and the restricted substances list. We're going to take a look at those, what the impacts of those really are to us, and the best practices that we can follow to try and get our products compliant with these requirements with the least amount of costs and resources directed at that effort. Okay, then finally, we're going to get into the meat of this thing, and this is really what I think most people here are interested in, is changes to the definition of an article. How we address REACH is changing, and through 2018, we're going to see that change quite a bit. And so we all need to understand exactly why it's changing, what the change is, and what the impact is to us, so that we can get in front of this. Okay, and then I'm just going to finish up a little bit about how some of the advantages of working with GreenSoft to take care of these requirements, just a couple minutes at the end, and then we'll go into Q&A. All right, so let's get started here. Who is GreenSoft? What do we do? GreenSoft's been around for over 15 years now, and we've been a leader in environmental compliance. And basically what we are is we're two companies in one. Okay, so we have a data center which actually goes out to your supply chain, collects all the compliance and substance data. We validate that data for accuracy and correctness, and we convert it into any format needed, including the format for our own software if that's what's needed. We also have a software tool which comes in different sizes and capabilities, because we know that nobody's needs are the same. And so whether you have just a very small startup and you just need a single seat desktop license, or whether you're a global conglomerate that needs global access across multiple business units, we have a solution for everybody. So we've got a lot of experience in collecting, formatting, and doing compliance reporting on products. And we can also do this just for a single product if a small company just needs a little bit of help. Okay, we are headquartered in Pasadena, California, but we have offices all over the world. We have over 120 employees, so we're not a startup and we're not a small, garage operation. We're actually an established industry leader. We have our main center where we do most of our data collection and validation is in China, about 180 miles south of Beijing, and our processes have all been validated by a third party and are ISO 9001 certified. This is just a quick snapshot of some of the industries and customers that we work with. So you can see that we have a lot of experience throughout the entire industry. You may recognize some of these companies, maybe you work with them, maybe you don't, but we have extensive experience in aerospace, power, communications, semiconductors, medical equipment, as well as some, maybe some actors in the supply chain that maybe aren't traditional, like 3M and GE, okay? So one other thing I want you guys to be aware of as we're talking about REACH, about GreenSoft, is that we have a situation where, while we're talking about REACH, we actually help customers with all kinds of different environmental regulations. And this is just like maybe the top 22 or so that we do the most often. So these are the kinds of things our customers need the most help with. But if you have a requirement that's not on this list, we can probably help you, including customized customer requirements. So that's about us and what we do. We do that compliance for you. And then I'm going to go through now what we view as the best practices and some of the things we've adopted. So whether you use us or not, at least you can have an understanding of how to execute a good compliance strategy. Okay, so what is REACH? REACH is basically chemical legislation in the European Union. And what it's really designed to do is restrict chemicals and substances. It's really not a product control regulation. But the problem is that because it restricts chemicals, it has some authorization requirements for chemicals and some supply chain communication requirements for these substances. The problem is that our products are made out of chemicals, and so we get sucked into this requirement as what they call articles. So substances present in articles. So that's where we get hit, okay? And we also have to keep in mind that as we're moving through these requirements, if we have an article or a product that expels a substance into the world or into the atmosphere or onto the skin, for example, a toner cartridge or an ink pen, which is expelling a substance, then we would need to address the article and we need to address that substance as well, right? So we need to keep that in mind, that there may be some corner cases. All right, so moving on then, we know what REACH is now. So what is it that we need to be concerned about? So we're going to put our process together, but we need to know exactly what our concerns are first. So the first thing we want to know is, does the article expel any mixtures or substances? As we discussed, we need to be able to treat those separately if we know they're there. We need to find out if we're manufacturing our article in the EU or if we're importing it into the EU, because there are differences there. And we're going to talk about that later when we get into the authorization list. Okay, but it's important up front that we know whether that's a concern or not, right? So that's a question we need to ask ourselves. Another one we need to know is that a clear understanding of the definition of an article is required to do this correctly. So we need to make sure not only that we understand what an article is under this regulation, but that our suppliers do as well, okay? And then we also need to take a look at the Annex 17 restriction list and make sure that there's no entries that apply to our product, and if they do, that we've done an adequate validation for that as well. Okay, and then one more thing to keep in mind is that this substance list gets updated at least every 6 months. So the SVHC list gets updated every 6 months. The Annex 17 and Annex 14 lists get updated here and there. So when we take a look at this, guaranteed every 6 months change, we need to make sure we have a process in place that isn't a one-time thing. It's not a Hail Mary, okay, we got our data, we're good. We've got our data, now let's go right back into collecting more data because we have more substances coming, that kind of thing. But in the end, regardless of what the legal requirements are, what we need to be concerned with on the legal perspective, we also need to take our customer requirements into account. Because no matter what we're doing on this end, if we're not doing what our customer expects of us, we're going to have a problem. Okay, so we've gone over REACH, what it is, and how we're going to kind of prioritize the information that we need to collect. So now let's go into the SVHC candidate list. So the SVHC candidate list is a list of substances which may later become authorized or restricted, okay? Once a substance is added to this list, producers are required to evaluate their products to see if there's any of these substances present in any articles in their products in amounts greater than 1,000 parts per million. If one of these substances is present, there's some responsibilities that kick in. Now, keep in mind, a product can't really be non-compliant for REACH. It can only have substances and have some communication, registration, authorization requirements. The only time you can be non-compliant with REACH is if you're using an actual restricted substance, right? So whether or not the SVHC is present in a product does not define pass-fail. It just means that it's present, we have some communication responsibilities. So what are those? So we're required to tell professional customers that the SVHC is there. And at a minimum, I'm required to tell them what SVHC is there. So this SVHC is present in this ASIC I'm supplying you. So when you put it on your motherboard, you know it's there, right? I'm required to tell you that. This is just professional customers only, like ODM customers, OEM customers, and importers, distributors, those kinds of people. You're not required to provide this to the end user unless they request it. If they request it, you have 45 days. Additionally, if you're importing more than 1 ton per year of this substance as a result of it being present, then there are maybe some official notification requirements that are triggered. So you need to be aware of that, and not only tracking the concentration of these substances in your product, but the number of substances you're shipping so you can determine the annual tonnage that's being shipped for that SVHC. Honestly, it's very uncommon for enough of an electronic product to be imported or manufactured in the EU that an SVHC will exceed the 1 ton threshold, but you still need to check. There are currently 174 substances on this list. Okay, so that's a big deal because that's going to change probably December, maybe January. It's usually June, July, and December, January is when they do the additions. Right now, they're looking at adding 8 additional substances. So if all of them get approved for inclusion, then in December, we could see this number go to 182. And any certificates we have for 174 will now be obsolete, and we'll have to go back again. So any REACH certifications you're getting have very short lifespans. Okay, so how do we attack this? Well, the first thing we're going to do is collect full material declaration data whenever possible. And what an FMD is it's a complete representation of the substance content of a part or a product. So for an example, in an IC, you might have a lead frame, an encapsulation, and a die. And in that case, it's going to tell me how much the die weighs, how much the encapsulation weighs, and how much every component material within that IC weighs. And then it's going to tell me the exact substance content of each of those materials. So if the individual part weighs, say, 1 gram, then the substances reported will add up to 1 gram. Now that I know every substance present in this part, no matter what substance inquiry you send me, no matter what regulation you ask me about, I can tell you the compliance status based on the substance content. However, not all FMDs are created equal. Pay close attention to proprietary substances. Proprietary substances will get you because, for example, if I get an IC from somebody and they say, okay, well, here's my full material declaration, but I'm using a proprietary epoxy in this, and I'm not going to tell you the exact mixture that I'm using in my epoxy because that's my secret sauce and I'm not sharing that. Okay, well, now I have a problem because I don't know if there's any SVHCs in their secret sauce, and they're not going to disclose what's in their secret sauce. So now I'm going to have to go back to them and get additional information, right? But keep in mind when you're collecting this information from suppliers, also you need to be very persistent and patient with them because they're struggling with this just like you are. They have to go to their supply chain every 6 months and try and get the data you need and then aggregate that and make that available to you as soon as possible, just like you're doing for your customers. So you're not going to be able to just this isn't a turnkey project where you just send out some emails, you get the responses, and in a few weeks you're good to go. That's not how this works, okay? We see on average, it takes 4 communications with a supplier to get valid data and documentation out of them. That means that some of them will respond with good data on the first try, and some of them are going to take 20 tries. So there's a lot of resources in tracking and communicating this information between the supplier and you and your customer. So just keep in mind that if you don't have those resources in-house, you may have to go outside for that, okay? Some other best practices here that we want to talk about. Make sure you have a good, strong validation process in place for the data coming in. We see a lot of bad data. Like I said, 4 times back and forth for them correcting data. So don't just accept whatever they give you and be like, okay, we're done. There's an expectation here that you're actually doing some kind of due diligence in validating this information. And besides, whatever quality information you're willing to accept, the quality data you're giving to your customers is going to be exactly the same, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So your process needs to include strong validation. And also keep in mind, there's going to be parts where you can't get data from your supply chain. An example is built to spec items. I create a drawing for a chassis, and I throw that off to a fabricator and say, build me 500 of these chassis. So they take the drawing, they look at the materials you say, they build it for you, and they give it to you. Then you go back to them 6 months later and say, give me a full material declaration on these parts you produced for me 6 months ago. And they go, well, it was made out of steel. We don't know. What do you want from us? We use, they're not going to provide you this information. And so what we're going to need to do then is assess those material drawings, do some calculations, and come up with our own material content based on the specifications of the materials and the drawings you produce. So you need to make sure you have a process in place for dealing with those cases, because otherwise you'll never get 100% validation on a product. That is, unless your product is 100% made out of off-the-shelf parts, right? What we're seeing typically is about 80 to 85% of a product can be validated using off-the-shelf parts in the supplier data. Then we can get maybe another 10% analyzing the drawing files and fabrication files and material specifications referenced for the fabricated parts. And then there will be some stragglers left over where the suppliers didn't respond or unable to give us the data we need. And then we either have to take those few that are left, and we either need to go through lab tasting, or we need to find a supplier who can give us the data we need and replace that part with one from an alternate supplier. Okay. So that's kind of an overview of SVHC and how we're going to comply with that. Now let's look at Annex 14 with the authorization list. Now, Annex 14 is a subset of the SVHCs. When a substance is added to the substance of very high concern list, it is then eligible later to be adopted into the Annex 14 list. So the substance very high concern is really a candidate list for further action. So once we know that, we can see, okay, so some of the SVHCs are actually Annex 14 substances as well. So there's a restriction on using these SVHCs within the EU unless you're authorized for that use. So what that means is that this is not applicable to any article that's being imported into the EU. Okay, that's an important designation here, and I want to be clear about this, that while Annex 14 does not apply to articles being imported in the EU, the SVHC requirements and the Annex 17 requirements do. That exemption of imported parts is only for Annex 14, and I want to make that clear. Okay, and it says right here, while not applicable to articles imported into the EU, it is applicable to manufacturers of articles within the EU. That's because if you take that substance and use it to make something, now you're using it in the EU and you're subject to authorization to use it. Okay. So if you're going to incorporate an Annex 14 substance into an article in the EU, you need to make sure you get authorization to do so before you do it. Now, the good thing is that this doesn't apply to most of us because most of us don't actually manufacture components in the EU, but maybe some of us do. But even though this may not be applicable to us, even though we may say, okay, well, we produce our products in Malaysia. We make resistors. We make them in Malaysia and Singapore and China. So we don't have to worry about this. We're going to ship them into Europe. This doesn't apply to us. But if you're selling to a customer who fabricates in the EU, they may want to know that you have Annex 14 substances in your parts and that you've incorporated that outside of the EU for traceability perspectives, because they're going to be off on the hook later on to show, hey, are you using Annex 14 substances in your computer or whatever you're making? Yes, I am. Okay, show us that you didn't violate Annex 14 and incorporate those into your product, in a way that was not allowed. So then they have to go show their traceability. Well, that's in this resistor. We got this resistor. It was imported in from, and they can show the traceability. So they're going to want to get that information from you. So don't be like, oh, well, hey, I'm not making in the EU, so I'm not going to have to worry about this. Your customers may tell you, you have to worry about this. And we have several customers of ours who their customers are forcing them to do this, even though they don't actually produce their product within the EU. Okay. And one other thing I want to mention here is that if you're importing substances or mixtures into the EU, they are in scope. That it's only articles that are out of scope if it contains these substances. All right. So how do we want to meet this requirement? The first thing we're going to want to do, of course, is try to collect the FMD, right? If we know everything that's in a part, then we know whether or not it contains any of these substances. But we're also going to have to understand that some parts are not going to have FMD and some are going to have proprietary substances. So we may need to do a combination of FMD for some parts, certificates of compliance for other parts, and maybe FMD and COCs, if we can, for the parts in between, right, the proprietary substances. That gives us the most flexibility moving forward. But the problem with a COC is that you're going to have to get a new one every 6 months, right? So you want to try and collect as much true FMD as possible. And that's what we do for our customers. Okay. There is no minimum threshold, so you can't take an SV8C declaration. You can't see a piece of paper that says, oh, we don't contain any SV8Cs over 1,000 parts per million, and use that to do Annex 14 compliance, even though Annex 14 is a subset of that list, because there's a 1,000 parts per million threshold for reporting SV8Cs here, and that threshold is not present in Annex 14. So because of that, we need to be aware that we're going to have to ask the question about Annex 14 separately from the SV8C question, right? And if we're going to actually try and roll this up into a product level compliance, we're going to need some kind of software tool like GreenSoft's GDM software that can actually take that information, roll it up at the product level while still maintaining article level compliance. Okay. So now we're moving forward to the Annex 17 restricted list. This one is a little bit more difficult to address, and it's a little bit harder to wrap our minds around because of how it's written. It's kind of an adoption of different regulations from pre-REACH, like the CLP directive, which defined which substances were hazardous and which ones were not allowed to be used and things like that. So what they've done here is instead of creating just a flat list of substances, they do have some appendixes in the back of the regulation that help you get substance lists, but they're never updated to keep up with the latest legislation. So you need to be tracking this yourself, right? And as a result, there's not an all-inclusive substance list you can just go online and find. Like I can go online, I can get the SVC list, I can go online, I can get the Annex 14 list. But if you go online and try and get the list of substances for Annex 17, what you're going to get is and you can see this as a typo up here, we can see that we're going to get 68 entries. And each entry has a different scope and applicability and different restrictions as well. So some are going to restrict the substance for use. Some are going to demand you create a warning and put it on the product. So you really have to look at these individually as to their impact. So here's some examples. BPA, restricted endothermal paper, made available after January 2020. So while we all know BPA is a hot button item and everybody's talking about BPA, from a REACH perspective, we don't want to run BPA against our product and get a false failure, because the reality is that we don't care about BPA unless we're producing paper, okay? Or we're including thermal paper in our product, which we probably aren't. So in this perspective, we can ignore entry 66. Entry 23 restricts cadmium, but only in certain paints and polymers that are on articles, right? So if our article doesn't contain certain paints and polymers, we can ignore this and not do an evaluation for cadmium, right? But then we look at entry 29 and we see it gets a little fuzzier here, right? Because it tells us we restrict substances which appear in the CLP directive. Actually, it says technically it appears in the CLP directive or not, that are classified as germ cell mutagen category 1A or 1B, or mutagen category 1 or 2. So it's not giving me a list of substances I can run. It's saying, hey, if you have a substance that meets the definition of these categories, it's restricted, right? So how the heck are we supposed to figure that out? I'm not quite sure. So we might need help for that, because if you just run the entire substance list against your product and then you try and figure out which ones of the substances that are there apply to you, you're going to be spending a lot of time and resources doing that. The other problem is a lot of entries don't apply to articles at all. So if we're just concerned about articles, we definitely don't want to run things on substances and mixtures, you know, against our product, because we're just doing work that is worthless to us. So what do we need to do? Well, first of all, back to collecting the FMD and COCs. We already went over that, so I'm not going to beat a dead horse there. But we're going to need a software tool for this. There's no way we can roll up this kind of information ahead of time. The tool should provide the ability to apply substance restrictions based on the category. So in other words, if I make a toy, I should be able to only apply the substances that are applicable to the toy I'm making. That might be plastics, prolonged skin contact, substances going in the toys placed in the mouth, whatever. So I want to pre-filter my product type and product use before I do my analysis. That'll eliminate 80% of the work up front, okay? So the best practice for that would be to use some kind of software package like GDM that has this capability already built in. So we've actually gone through and already scrubbed all these directives, the CLP directive, and we've come up with these substance lists for you. We've categorized them into 20 categories so that you can simply select what you need to apply to your specific product or BOM and then instantly view the compliance status. You don't need to run a substance list and then start reading the entries and digging in. That's been done for you up front. And if you're classifying with commodity codes, it is helpful to be able to automatically use those commodity codes to determine the applicability of the restrictions under Annex 17. And that's something that maybe you want to consider doing. Our software has the ability to do that, but it's something you could do or not do depending on how you use commodity codes. And here's an example from our software, just a quick snapshot. So you can see that there's entries that apply to wood, aerosols, paper, leather, paints, plastics, air fresheners, extender oils, placed in mouth by children, prolonged skin contact. So as we go through these, we can actually see if I make an Ethernet card, right? Then I can eliminate measuring devices, skin contact, place in mouth by children, extender oils, air freshener, jewelry. None of these apply to me, right? I'm not selling mixtures or substances. So I'm looking at metals, maybe. Maybe I want to include metals, metal plating, plastics, and adhesives. And that's it. And I'm going to run that against my product, and I've eliminated all the other stuff and got it out of the way. So that's basically what you want to do with Annex 17 is pre-filtering, and you need to have that done in an intelligent manner. All right. So now that we've gone through the SVHC list, we've gone through Annex 14, which is only applicable to products that are being made in the EU. It's for substances that are used to make or incorporated into an article while in the EU. And then we went over Annex 17 and what those requirements are. But we've kind of just been all over the place, so let me try and summarize some of these requirements and what our producer responsibilities are, okay? So when we look at this condition over here on the left column, we can see the different conditions we're going to walk through. And the initial condition here is that we've evaluated our product, and we've determined that there are no articles in our product with an SVHC over 1,000 parts per million. So we've determined that we're good here. We have no communication requirements because we have no SVHCs over 1,000. We have no notification requirements because we're not importing any over a ton. And we have nothing of authorization. We have no restriction. We have to do nothing here, okay? But let's say that we've done our evaluation and we do find an SVHC present. Now what do we do? Okay, so we have our product, there's a part in our product, it's got an SVHC over 1,000 parts per million. I now need to communicate that to my professional customers, and I need to make that information available to my end users upon request. You'll notice that for the professional customers, I'm only required to provide them the name of the substance and also provide them safe use of the article if that information is available. So in other words, this has this substance in it, don't burn it. However, if the end user requests this information, I need to also provide safety information about the substance and the article. It has this substance in it. It's been shown to cause cancer when inhaled. Do not burn this cider, right? That kind of thing. So this is our only responsibility if we have the SVHC present is communication in the supply chain and fulfilling customer requests for information. So when you look at it from that perspective, this SVHC content is not making me non-compliant. This product is no longer compliant with REACH because it has the SVHC. It's like I talked about, it can't be compliant or non-compliant. It just has some substances that cause you to do things, okay? So now let's go to the next condition. Let's say that we still have that SVHC present, but we're importing more than a ton annually of that SVHC into the EU as a result of the import of this product, okay? So my communication responsibility is still in place, but now we have a situation here where we have to notify the European Chemicals Agency that I'm importing this SVHC into the European Union at over a ton per year, okay? And there are some exemptions that you can get away from doing that, but you definitely want to track the tonnage and do your analysis to see if you qualify for one of those exemptions before you go ahead and just decide to skip the whole notification. Right? So let's go to the next step now. All right, so now we have the substance in our product. It's 1 ton per year is going into the EU. And it's in the toner in our toner cartridge. So now what do we do? Because we talked about having to treat that separately. Well, if it's in the toner in our toner cartridge and it's intended to be released, substances and mixtures imported into the EU over 1 ton as part of the article import are required to be registered for that use. So you're going to have to check the registration and make sure that that substance has been registered for that use. Usually it's been registered by the raw substance producer, and so it probably has, but you're going to need to check. Again, extreme corner case because that implies that not only do you have the SV8C present, but you're importing more than a ton of that SV8C, and it's being expelled from the article. So most article manufacturers are not concerned with registration. It's mostly for chemical companies. Okay. Now we go into the Annex 14, which again, Annex 14 itself is only applicable to manufacturers of articles within the EU. If you're importing your article, you can ignore this unless your customer says otherwise. But assuming you do have an Annex 14 substance present in your product and that substance was incorporated into your article within the EU, then you need to make sure that you're authorized to incorporate it into your article before you use it. It's as simple as that. You are not allowed to use that substance in the EU to make your product or your article until you've been authorized for that use. Okay. And then the final condition we're going to talk about is having the presence of an Annex 17 substance. And we're not talking about it just being there, but we're talking about an Annex 17 substance which is used in a manner which is restricted under one or more Annex 17 entry. So for example, we have some of that cadmium-based paint that's restricted under entry 23, and I cannot use that paint. It's not allowed. So what can I do? I can go use another paint so that I can sell this in the EU. That's the only thing I can do. The substance cannot be used. There are some restrictions which don't restrict use, but do put notifications in there. So this is a general statement, but in general, in most cases, when it comes to articles, it has to do with, the substance cannot be used in these kind of applications. Okay. So, all right, so we're halfway through here now, and we've talked about some of the initial concerns that we have as we move into REACH compliance. We've talked about the SV8C list and some of the best practices for meeting that. We've talked about Annex 14, how it only applies to articles fabricated within the EU, but how some companies are demanding that information even if your parts are not fabricated in the EU. We talked about Annex 17 and how it's really an entry-based regulation, and every entry has different scope and different applicability. And so when we look at that, we need to take a look at that backwards, where we need to go from the product up instead of from the substance down. Okay, now let's take a look at the big issue here. The big change is the one everyone's talking about, and that is the changes to the definition of an article. Now, when we say, well, how does the definition of the word article change? It really doesn't. What really changed is what the authorities expect us to interpret an article as. So let's talk about that. So what is an article? What is it, and how do we calculate the substance concentrations within it? Right? An article is an object which during production is given a special shape, surface, or design, which determines its function to a greater degree than does its chemical composition. As an example, we'll take a bottle of Windex. So if you take a bottle of Windex, the bottle itself is an article. If I take that bottle and I squish it down till it's flat, it's no longer a bottle, it's just a flat piece of plastic. However, if I take that Windex, its shape, surface, or design is irrelevant. It stays Windex until I alter its chemistry. So the bottle is an article, Windex is a mixture. Okay. So what the industry did when this regulation first came out, about 10 years ago, is the industry said, okay, this is easy for me to interpret. What do I produce? I produce an Ethernet card. Well, that's an article. It meets the definition of an article. I produce a hard drive. It meets the definition of an article. I produce a toilet seat. It meets the definition of an article. It doesn't matter what I produce. It meets the definition of an article. So I just need to calculate the presence of an SV8C to make sure it's not 1,000 parts per million of my article, my end product. Okay. So what did that really mean to the supply chain? And how is that a problem that the Europeans decided they wanted to change? Well, let's take a look at just kind of a simplified supply chain. I'm a manufacturer of this lead frame here. This lead frame is going to get embedded in this IC manufacturer's part. In my lead frame, I've got 20 milligrams of an SV8C, and my lead frame weighs 2 grams. So that's 10,000 parts per million. Okay, so at this point, I have responsibilities, as we talked about. I have to communicate this to my professional users. In this case, my professional user is the company who's buying it and integrating it. So the problem is the IC manufacturer is now going to embed my lead frame into his IC, and then he is going to sell his IC to this motherboard manufacturer. But when he does takes this information and calculates his SV8C content. He goes, well, my IC weighs 21 grams. Well, I still have the 20 milligrams of that SV8C present in my IC. But since my IC is now the article, when I calculate the concentration, I can see it's under 1,000 parts per million. Is it reportable? No. I don't have to tell this guy it's even there. But let's say I tell him anyway, just to be nice. Well, then he takes his product and he does his analysis and calculation, and he says, well, my motherboard weighs 800 grams, and I've got 20 milligrams of this SV8C present in an article. So that's 25 ppm of my article. So I don't have to report it either. So he doesn't have to tell the PC manufacturer it's there. And then a PC manufacturer is in the same boat. Even if he's aware of this information, it's 2 ppm of the product he's selling. So is it over 1,000 parts per million of his article? No, it's not. So you can see that the reportability of the substance disappears as it goes up the supply chain. So several members of the EU, several member states came back and said that doesn't make sense. You shouldn't be able to add mass to your product to reduce your environmental reporting requirements. So they challenged this interpretation in court. And so what happened was the European Court of Justice came back and said, although the interpretation originally was the substance aggregation should be at the final article or final product level, we've decided that if something's an article, it's always an article. Right? So in the old case here, we can see if this is an Ethernet card and we have one resistor that has over 1,000 parts per million of an SV8C, when we calculate that as a function of the mass of the whole Ethernet card, it drops it below 1,000 parts per million, and we don't need to notify. So the resistor supplier had to notify that because it's there, but I didn't have to notify because my product has diluted the concentration. Under the new ruling or the new interpretation, they're saying that you don't get to dilute it, that it is whatever article contained that you embedded in your product, that's the concentration base. You don't get to dilute it simply because you installed that in a bigger product. Okay. So this was back in 2015 that the once an article, always an article decision came out. And then what happened was the European Chemicals Agency said, okay, we're going to go ahead and update our guidance for articles document to show exactly what we expect from you from an interpretation perspective. How are you going to do these calculations in light of this change, right? Yeah. And so they issued this document, which just came out in June of this year. And not only does it provide lots of examples of how you calculate SV8C in articles, but it also confirms without a doubt that subparts of electronic components are potential articles. So how does that change the supply chain? Let's look at this same scenario again. So we still have our that 10,000 parts per million of the SV8C in our lead frame. We incorporate that lead frame into our IC, and we're ready to communicate that to the motherboard supplier. What changed? What do we need to do? Well, because this is still an article, since we still have to, we don't get to dilute this, we have to calculate the concentration of the worst case concentration of any article in our product. We now have a complex product made up of articles. This is no longer an article. And I have to let this guy know that I have an article in my IC that contains 10,000 ppm of SV8C. And then he goes, okay, thank you for that. Now he's got to sell his motherboard to the PC manufacturer. He's got to tell the PC manufacturer, guess what? There's an SV8C present in my motherboard at 10,000 ppm worst case, okay? So this is required to be communicated to the PC manufacturer. Now the PC manufacturer is going to sell his PC in Europe and he's going to send it to an importer. He's got to tell the importer the same thing. So what we've seen here is we've seen the compliance status of this IC, this motherboard, and this PC change as a result of this interpretation change. We've also seen the responsibilities of the manufacturer for each of these three change. These three manufacturers had no responsibility previously, and now they do. So what these three manufacturers need to be doing right now is going through every single one of their reach evaluations they've done in the past. And they need to apply this new methodology, and they need to see whether or not they need to change the compliance reporting of their products. Are compliance, have they reported as not containing SV8Cs? Have their chat status been changed? And how, are they incorrectly reporting the compliance status of their products now? Okay. So let's take a look at what this means when you look it down into component level. We talked about how that lead frame could have an SV8C and what that really means. Let's do an evaluation of a component. Here we have a simple IC, and we have the materials within that IC that I've extracted from the full material declaration data that I've received from them. So I asked them for an FMD, they give it back to me. They said there's a mold compound with these substances, a lead frame with these substances, etc. These are what the parts are made out of. Now my next step is going to be to determine which materials in this IC meet the definition of an article. And what that means is, did they meet the definition of an article before the IC was constructed? So was I taking a bunch of articles and combining them together? Or did they only become articles after they were embedded into the IC? Right? So if we look at this same table now and we look at it from the bottom up, it makes sense. So we took a lead frame and we plated it. Okay, the lead frame is an article. If it contains an SVHC, we have to calculate it as a function of that lead frame because it's always going to be an article. But once we plate it, we take a mixture, we add it to that article, we create a new article, which is a complex object shown in pink. So if we have an SVHC in the plating, we need to calculate that as the function of the mass of the plated lead frame. Because plating is not an article, so we don't have to calculate it there. We calculate it at the next article level. And the same goes through when we take the dye and glue it to the plated lead frame, we create a new article. So this makes more sense when we look at it from a hierarchy perspective. So we can see kind of a representation here of what we're talking about. So we're going to take this lead frame and we're going to plate it. We're going to take an article and plate it and create a new article here in pink, and we can see that represented here in the bottom. Then what we're doing is we're taking the dye and we're using dye attach, which is an adhesive, to glue that to the plated lead frame. Once we've done that, we've created a new article which contains the dye attach and the dye, as well as the lead frame that's been plated. Okay. So if we have an SVHC in this dye attach, it needs to be calculated as a function of the dye lead frame assembly, right? So it's going to be calculated concentration-wise against the mass of the dye attach and lead frame and plating. Okay. So the same thing goes as we move forward up the chain. So if the mold compound has something, you're going to take that as a function of the whole IC, because the mold compound doesn't get incorporated until everything else is done and it gets poured over the top. So you can see how that's done here, this analysis, and we can see the concentration base, for example, if we have an SVHC and a dye attach, the concentration base is the dye lead frame assembly, right? Because you go up the chain till you find your first article, and that's where you are, okay? Once you have this done, then we can evaluate the compliance status, and we have to do it for each article within our product. So we evaluate the lead frame, the plated lead frame, the dye lead frame assembly, the wire bond, the top assembly, and the final IC. And if any of those points we contain an SVHC over 1,000 parts per million, then we have to communicate that. And if we have it in more than one spot, we will communicate the worst case concentration. So for example, if we have lead oxide in the plated lead frame at 1,500 ppm, but we have lead oxide in the top assembly, or in a dye, say at 2,000 ppm, then the worst case would be 2,000, we would apply that, okay? Okay, so what happened next after we did it? We've been working on this for a long, long time. And so I actually, once we put our interpretation together, what I just presented to you, and once we started working on our software solution and redesigning our software to meet this requirement, I held a meeting with the European Chemicals Agency to make sure that we were on the right road, that we were doing the right thing, and they agreed with us, our interpretation and our approach. So on August 16th, which was, I think, just maybe 6 or 7 weeks after the guidance document was released by European Chemicals Agency, I was able to obtain a meeting with 2 of their scientific officers. And I gave them the presentation I just gave you. I asked them for input and asked them specifically to confirm that they agree with our interpretation and our approach. And they did so. They confirmed our interpretation of the definition of an article, as I presented to you guys, has been confirmed correct by European Chemicals Agency. They've confirmed that how we're doing the article aggregation, where we're taking the materials, breaking them up, and applying aggregation flags to show for each material what material or series of materials constitute the concentration base for calculations, is the best way to apply ensure SVHC calculations are being performed per their guidance. Okay. They also made a direct statement to me that they're getting a lot of questions about electronic components, and that elements inside an electronic component are definitely articles if they met the definition of article prior to component production. But they did make a couple of additional points to me that they want me to communicate to my customers, and I'm doing that here. The number one thing is that if we can't do the kind of analysis I just showed you, there are not always going to be cases where we can do that analysis, then we need to take a worst case approach and apply a homogeneous analysis. We want to do that as seldom as possible, because if you think about it, homogeneous concentration of an SVHC in the die attach, there's such a minute amount of die attach used to glue the die to the lead frame that if that thing is, say, 2,000 ppm of an SVHC, as a function of the lead frame assembly, it's going to be less than 1,000. So by doing homogeneous, we'd be actually making more work for ourselves and making us have to report things we really don't have to report. So that should only be used when we can't do any kind of other analysis, okay? And then the other point that they said is that care should be taken to apply the mixtures and articles to the correct article parent. Like we said, the die attach can't be applied to the whole article, the whole IC, because the die attach was used to create a complex object within the IC before the IC was finished being built. Okay, so what are we going to do to comply with these requirements? First of all, we may need additional information on component construction to adequately validate data we're getting. We may need to know more about how the product or component was produced, or at least have expertise to understand how those typical parts are produced. For example, the IC I showed you, pretty much that type of ICs constructed about the same way. So if we have full material declaration, we can basically make some assumptions and deconstruct it. On the other hand, if we've got a voltage regulator with multiple ICs, 2 PC boards inside of it all potted together, then maybe we're not going to be able to do that. It's too complex, and then we're going to have to take another approach. Also, we need to consider that these additional information we need from our suppliers, our customers are going to need from us. So we're going to have to update our communication methodologies going outward as well. So, and just keep in mind too that evaluation of construction can be complex. So you either want to work with your suppliers or an expert on this, or you're going to have to make some assumptions or use other approaches. Because, for example, a piece of wire, if I take a piece of copper and pull it through some PVC insulation, I've basically taken an article and pulled it through an article, right? So if there's an SVHC in that insulation, you calculate it as a mass of the insulation because that insulation existed as an article before I created the wire. On the other hand, if I take that copper and dip it into PVC and form it around it as a liquid and let it gel, now I have a situation where I took a mixture in an article and created a complex object. And so now I need to calculate it as a function of the finished wire because any SVHCs present in the PVC jacketing were not present as an article before I made the wire. So you can see that you don't always know when you buy wire how that wire was formed. And so you either need to have that information or have that communication with the supplier, make an assumption about how that wire was formed, or you need to go worst case, right? And we can help you with that kind of stuff in that communication, right? So what's going to happen here is that you're not going to be able to do these complex evaluations for every component. There are going to be cases where you use homogeneous thresholds or supplier COCs may be needed as well, okay? But what you want to do is do in a staged approach. So you take your full material declaration data, or whatever data you have, and you ask yourself the first question. Do we have SVHCs present over 1,000 parts per million at the homogeneous level? Yes or no? If the answer is no, you can move on. You obviously don't have it at the article level, right? If the answer is yes, then see if you can do the article evaluation. Well, let's break this part down and see what article that's a part of, and if it still still exceeds 1,000 parts per million. If it does, then it's reportable. Now, if you can't do that, maybe you go to your supplier and say, hey, there's an SVHC present. We can't tell whether it's over the threshold at the article level. You need to give us a certificate of compliance stating whether it is or not. Okay. The key here when you're collecting COCs too is to make sure that the COCs you're collecting mention that the product has been evaluated per the court decision and ECA guidance, right? And so that way you know that they didn't do it to the old method, basically. Right. So if you're using a software tool, just make sure that you have a software tool that can do what I just showed you how to do. Take full material declaration data and crunch it into sub-article level. And to do that, you have to be able to tell the software exactly which item is an article and which isn't, and the ones that aren't need to be assigned article basis so that you know, oh, this isn't an article. How do I calculate the concentration for SVHC here then? The software has to be able to dynamically apply those aggregation basis. And so just make sure that whether you use our solution or not, that you're looking for that, Okay, and just keep in mind too that software cannot determine article status of materials. Like I showed you how I went through and determined that this article and this mixture make up a new article, a new complex object. That's human intervention because every single FMD is going to use different terminology. It's not like you could tell the software, take a material that says lead frame and assign it article, right? Because some people are going to call it lead frame and some people are going to call it something else. So for that perspective, there always needs to be some manual processing going on when you're doing these article evaluations, okay? So that's pretty much it for the article stuff. I wanted to just kind of go quickly over how we can help you with these things. You can see this is a huge challenge. We put a lot of effort into putting a solution that makes it easy, okay? So working with GreenSoft has a lot of advantages. We have solutions for companies of all sizes, markets, and needs. But like we talked about, we can go ahead and do the data collection, validation, and management for you. We can manage your entire product and materials database, or we can do it product by product if you want. We've got all kinds of different software solutions to meet everybody's needs, right? And like I told you before, like if you're just a small startup, you have one product, you just need to validate it for each, you can just send us your BOM. We'll send the due diligence documents from your supply chain as well as the product disclosures, and you're ready to go. One of the good things about working with us is that when we do collect data from suppliers, we maintain that data in a huge database. And since we've been doing this for over 15 years, we've got 64 million part numbers from over 27,000 manufacturers in our database. And that's as of March, so probably more than that now, okay? And you can see that the level of data, we have 8 million parts with REACH SVHC 173 data. So that's pretty good because that was the latest as of March, okay? So when you look at this, you can say, okay, so I'm going to give GreenSoft a list of parts I need them to collect, and they'll probably be able to deliver a high percentage of them right away, especially if most of them are off the shelf, because they've probably collected them from another company and they already have the data available. Okay. So if you partner with us, you're getting access to a database of 64 million parts right away. And you don't get charged for any parts until they're actually delivered to you. So, I mean, it's perfect. And then we make it our goal to collect as much FMD data as possible so that as we're going back through the maintenance cycle, as you're working with your suppliers, you don't have a low percentage completion because the data's changed, right? We're doing FMD as much as possible and also pushing on the supply chain to increase FMD percentage availability, right? And then we also are ISO 9000 certified. So when you come to us and partner with us to offload all of this work to us, you can be guaranteed that it's meeting the quality standards that your own company has, right? So we can maintain all this data we provide you within 6 months freshness level. So again, the data's requirements are updated every 6 months. So is the data we're delivering. So once again, you don't have to be tracking these changes. You don't have to be tracking your suppliers. We're doing all that for you, okay? And going back to the software again, we have hosted solutions where you don't even have to involve your IT group. You can just send us your parts list and we'll send you a login. You can log into our system, or you can have a worldwide browser-based system where you can actually have collaborative efforts within different business units all over the world. We can have in-house workgroup edition that allows collaboration between different groups within the same facility, and even simple desktop editions for startups. So it just kind of depends what you need. The key here that most people want to ask me is ERP, PLM integration. We do have that. Our software has been integrated with Agile, SAP, things like that. So that's not a problem at all. And regulation updates happen automatically in the software. So if you're using our software, you don't have to track regulation updates. We do it for you. The cost is really cheap as well. We've estimated during the study that it costs $46 per part to collect this kind of data, and we can do it for a fraction of that. And our software has won awards for its capabilities and also cost effectiveness, and we have very low entry cost software. So thanks for sitting through the little spiel at the end. I appreciate that. Now I'm going to turn it over to Amy and see if we can cover some questions.
Yeah, we have a whole bunch of questions today, so we'll jump right into it. Are all of the forbidden substances of ROS now included on the SVHC list for REACH?
No, they're not. And they may never be completely because they're handled a little bit differently. So if you look at the ROS directive, for example, if you take lead into account, you see that lead and lead compounds are restricted. So basically, any compound that contains lead in it is managed under ROS. So when you go and you look at REACH, it calls out specific, for example, lead oxide. Lead oxide, red number 8, whatever. So REACH is going at a chemical by chemical and substance by substance instead of substance group regulation. So you may never see them align exactly.
Okay, and who is the regulating agency that will be responsible to audit the manufacturer's REACH assessment documentation as evidence that the analysis was performed?
There really is not one regulating agency. Each member state is responsible for enforcing the regulation. This is not a directive, so the member states don't actually have their own legislation to enforce. They have to enforce this as it is, unlike the Rose Directive. So what's happening, what we're seeing here is that enforcement is being done differently in every member state, and there really isn't a process for you to submit your data for approval. What would happen is that typically, so far in enforcement, what happens is that this is mostly self-certification, and what'll happen is someone will file a complaint, and then whatever the agency is responsible for handling that, like BSI and the UK was responsible before. I don't know how it's going to go in the UK after Brexit, but what happens is you see that they'll get a complaint, they'll buy the product, they'll do some testing on it, and then they'll engage the manufacturer and say, hey, you know, what's going on with this? Send us your data, right? So far, I haven't seen any cases happen with REACH in the electronics industry. They've gone after commodity people like flip-flops coming out of China that they're concerned are unhealthy, things like that. But yeah, there's no real entity that does that.
Okay, and what law, standard, or directive actually defines REACH as law?
Okay, let me get this. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's not a directive, it's a law. I'll just look it up real quick. I should have put this in the slides. I apologize for that. Okay, so what REACH is it's regulation EC number 1907/2006 of the European Parliament of the Council concerning registration, evaluation, authorization, restriction of chemicals. So this is actually a European Parliament law that all member states are required to comply with. It's different than the Rose Directive, which a directive comes out from the European Parliament and Commission, and then the member states have to enact national legislation to support it. This is actually legislation, not a directive.
Okay,
We'll put that in the what we're sending out at the end as well.
How do you define a sub-article?
Yeah, I kind of use that term, and maybe I shouldn't use that term in the slides. What I define as a sub-article is basically an article within a complex object. If you look at what's going on with the European Chemicals Agency's guidance document, whenever you take an article and you take a mixture, say a plating, and you plate that article, you've now created a new article, which is a complex object. So when I talk about complex objects, rather than go into complex objects, I just use article and subarticle to mean a complex object that has an article in it, basically.
All right. On slides 10 and 11, regarding expelled into the environment, would air drawn through a system used in a drying process be considered to be expelling into the environment if, say, ethanol is being evaporated?
That's actually a good question. That's kind of a gray area question. I would say that if typically what they say is that if this substance is intended to be released into the environment. So I think it's a gray area, and you could probably get away with not having to register that, just because there's no intention of releasing it into the environment.
Okay, can you define a bit more about homogeneous thresholds?
Sure. A homogeneous threshold comes actually from Rose compliance. And what homogeneous means is that uniform throughout. So for example, in the case of, if we go back to our IC here, we can see that they've broken our IC down into homogeneous materials. Some of them are articles, some of them are not. And they're basically the individual materials that went into making this product that can't be separated down any further. And what they mean is, what they say by separating is maybe you can't unscrew it or break it off or scrape it off, things like that. So while plating is not an article, plating is a homogeneous material. I can scrape the plating off and it's a separate material from the core pin or whatever. So that's what a homogeneous material is. It's basically going down to the lowest level of material that it can't be broken apart mechanically or otherwise by scraping.
Okay. Have you ever performed a construction analysis of a surface mount ceramic capacitor to determine if it is a complex article?
I have looked at a surface mount capacitor, and it's a little bit difficult for me to understand. I would need to see the actual manufacturing process. And so that's the kind of thing where maybe you would have to work with your supplier on that, because I think that depending on how it's being formed, you might be able to say that it was formed all at once, right? But I'm not, unfortunately, I'm just not an expert on the construction of those parts. So I'd have to look into that further.
Okay. Regarding the example of 1500 ppm in component article A, 2000 ppm in a different component article B, therefore report the 2000 ppm level. Is the 2000 ppm level reported with the weight of the top level article or for the weight of the component article B?
Okay. So you're going, when you say, is it reported at the top level or not? I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I'm going to try and answer this question. So basically, in the case where you have two articles within this IC that both have the same SVHC, and they have different levels of concentrations, and we say we have one at 1500 and one at 2000. What I'm doing is providing information to the purchaser of this IC. And so I'm going to say at the top level, this IC contains an article which contains 2000 ppm of this SVHC. That's what I'm going to say. So I don't know if I answered the question correctly or not, but it's calculated at whatever article level it's at. But when you report it, you're reporting it at the level you're selling the part at.
All right. In an article SVHC imported in the EU member, if an article SVHC imported in the EU member country exceeds 1 ton but does not get released into the environment, does it require registration?
It does not require registration, but it will require official notification unless you can meet the exemptions for notification, which basically just means that if you can show the substance poses no risk to the environment or the person, then you don't necessarily have to notify the European Chemicals Agency. That's the only real exemption. But yeah, so notification is yes, registration is no.
Okay. How soon does the manufacturer have to take corrective action to eliminate the SVHC in an article after the substance is published on the REACH compliance list?
There is no time, because there really is no requirement to eliminate it from the article. The day that the substance is published is the day your communication responsibilities kick in. So if they add it to the list and it's in your product, you need to notify your professional customers immediately. If you choose to remove that substance from the product, you have as much or little time as you want to take, but in the meantime, you're going to be communicating that it's there to your supply chain, or up your supply chain.
Does the manufacturer still need to notify its customer of the SVHC substance in an article retrospectively if the finished assembly was sold prior to the inclusion of the substance on the REACH SVHC list? Does
the manufacturer need to proactively? Okay, so we're saying that we sold it and not necessarily. However, your customers may require that, because let's say that you make a component like an IC and they buy 10,000 pieces, and then the SVHC list gets updated. They're going to expect you to support them, even though they bought that part beforehand. So I would say that, from a legal perspective, no, once you've sold it, you've sold it. You don't have to keep keeping compliance up on it. But from a customer support perspective, I would say, yes, you're going to need to do that.
Okay, we've had a lot of great questions. We still have just a few more. Can you expand? Oh, sorry. Is PVC now on the SVHC list?
It is. I believe that it has not, actually, no, SVHC list. I'm not sure of that. I believe that it was recently added, but I'll have to get back to you on that with the guidance document.
Okay. And do we at GreenSoft analyze for WEE?
We really is a collection and end-of-life management system. It's really not something that we can help with. We don't have the ability to do registration. So what you really need to do is find a consultant inside the EU that can help with that, because what you want to do is join some kind of collective or some kind of consortium there that does the end-of-life processing for you and the reports that need to be submitted. We don't help with that.
Okay. And who registers the article in the EU?
Well, the registration is really for a substance, not an article. And so the registration can be done by any actor in the supply chain. So let's say you're using a substance in your toner cartridge. The maker of that chemical that wants to sell that to you, to use in your toner cartridge, is probably already taken care of the registration. So you just need to talk to your supplier and see if they have. If they have, you're good to go. If not, you can go ahead through the process yourself and register that substance for use in toner cartridges over there. Really, there is no, it could be any actor that wants to use the substance, basically.
Okay. Many medical test products use genetic materials. Can I find a good reference online to define mutagen category 1 or 2 online?
Yeah, if you go to the CLP directive, which is actually referenced, the number is referenced, it's in up here, 1272, 2008. You go to the CLP directive, it has really good definitions of all those different categories, and that's what I would reference right there. And that's the classification and labeling of chemicals, basically, is what that directive is.
Perfect. Okay. Can you expand on what other countries outside the EU require REACH compliance?
Really, REACH is really a European phenomenon right now. There are some REACH-like regulations that are coming out. There's K-REACH in Korea, which is similar, but doesn't really apply to articles. It applies to certain chemicals and mixtures. There are some work going on in China for China REACH, again, very limited in scope. And we can see that some of the Russian Federation type countries over there, forget what the group of countries is over there. They're working on something, but there is nothing really specific that's exactly like REACH. In the U.S., we have the Toxic Substance Control Act, and we've got California Prop 65, which is probably like the closest thing to it in the U.S.
Okay, someone did ask if we will have this webinar recording available for you guys to view later, and yes, we'll send that out. And then someone else asked if we have any webinars like this planned to cover conflict minerals and handling of CMRTs. And yes, definitely. We do webinars on a regular basis, and that is a topic on our list of upcoming webinars. No date scheduled at this time, though, but if you subscribe to our blog or newsletter, we will definitely let you know in the blog or newsletter emails. And so now the very last question for Randy, unless anyone else sends in any final questions, is does GreenSoft provide separate assessments for ROS and REACH?
We definitely can provide separate assessments for ROS and REACH, but typically what happens in most cases is that a customer comes to us and asks for us to do them both at once. When you're collecting data from the supply chain, it makes sense to go ahead and hit two birds with one stone, so to speak. But definitely we have done projects where they just need REACH or they just need ROS, or maybe they need ROS on some parts and REACH on others. So we can do that. But from a perspective of cost and resources, it costs very little to include rows in the scope if we're already collecting REACH, because it's a matter of basically collecting one more document from the supplier while we're talking to them.
Okay, and another question did pop up. Do we support ITAR product analysis concerned with providing details to China source. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a concern. We are ITAR restricted, so we can't work directly with ITAR designs. We do have some defense customers who work in the ITAR world, and what they do is they actually just segregate the stuff that they're sending us so that we never get any kind of information from there that could be deemed ITAR non-compliant. So in that case, there are parts with those customers that we cannot work with, but we're able to actually support them, maybe 85% of their needs without them violating any ITAR restrictions.
Okay, great. That was the last question.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for spending the hour with me. I hope that you found this useful. I'm going to go through the questions and answer them in more detail before I send the Q&A out. We'll send it out in about a week or so. So in the meantime, I think most of you probably have my contact information. So feel free to send me other questions you have, and I'll include those as well.
Okay, thanks everyone. We'll go ahead and end the meeting. Thank you.